Would you say that you are regularly or oftentimes stressed out? How many times have you wondered, boy, I really wish there were more hours in the day? I think if you ever think that in your life or experience those things in your life, you need to stick around because we're going to see that today in the life of Moses. It happened in January 1999. In a matter of 2 weeks at the beginning of that year, 3 fishing vessels sunk into the Atlantic Ocean. It all started on January 6 when the Beth D. Bob sunk, killing 4 fishermen that were on board. Just 2 days later, the 107-foot Cape Fear also sunk, killing 2 fishermen. And then just several days after that, on January 18th, the 74-foot Adriatic fishing vessel sunk, killing 4 fishermen on board that ship. Now, we know that commercial fishing is a dangerous occupation. I mean, if you've ever seen that TV show, Deadliest Catch, it got that name for a reason. However, the fact that what happened in January 1999 was rare, and it was rare because it was 3 fishing vessels that sunk in just a matter of 2 weeks, but what made it even more rare was that all 3 fishing vessels came from the exact same pier. And when they investigated what had happened to these fishing vessels, they found some facts that were common to all 3 vessels. The first thing was that none of them had a hull break. None of them run aground, none of them hit rocks, none of them hit an iceberg or anything like that. Another thing that they all had in common was that all 3 vessels were captained by individuals that had 10 or more years experience behind the wheel of a fishing vessel. And the third thing that they had all in common was that they were all less than 15 miles away from their destination. They were heading back to the dock. And so what happened? What they discovered was the thing that all 3 of these fishing vessels also had in common was the reason all 3 of them sunk that month in 1999. And what they discovered was that all 3 fishing vessels were exceeding their limits in weight. All 3 of them had 10 to 15 tons extra weight than what they were supposed to be carrying. And when they began to investigate and find out what had happened, what they discovered was that this was just simply a common experience. That all the fishing vessels leaving that pier, all of them were usually exceeding their limits in weight. And that is true not just in fishing vessels, and really the principle that I want to give you today is true for fishing vessels, and it's true for my life in your life. And you may never in your life captain a fishing vessel, but there are times in your life when you are exceeding your limits. You're exceeding your limits emotionally, or you're exceeding your limits financially, or you're exceeding your limits even physically. And the truth is that all of us have limits in our lives. And those limits that you and I have vary from person to person. The financial limits that I have are not the financial limits that you probably have. The emotional limits that you experience in your life are probably not the same emotional limits that your coworker has. And all of us have these limits, and all of them vary. The important thing is to know the extent of your limits. You want to keep from exceeding your limits. And this is true that we live in a culture that pushes all of us to exceed our limits. And the irony in that is that though the culture pushes us to exceed our limits, the moment we exceed our limit and we sink, it's a culture that's there to condemn us for exceeding our limits. And some of you are watching today and you're exceeding your limits maybe in one area, but there's some of you that are exceeding the limits in your life in several different areas. Some of you are exceeding your time limits, and you're just running from one activity to the next to the next. Some of you are exceeding your emotional limits, and you're just one event in your life from just simply pushing you over the edge emotionally. Some of you are exceeding your limits physically, and just one more night of working overtime is going to push you over the limit physically, and you're going to experience a downfall in your life. It's going to cause you to sink. And so what we want to talk about here today is really that idea of not exceeding our limits, because the moment we begin to exceed our limits, the first things that get pushed out are the last things that should be pushed out. And the moment you and I start to exceed our limits, we're putting ourselves and the people around us in danger. And so the take-home truth that I want to give you, the principle that these fishing boat captains should have learned, the principle that I hope you learn in your life today is this, is unload before you overload. You and I need to unload before we overload, because the truth is this, is that you and I will never be able to experience God in the ways in which He wants us to experience Him if we continue to exceed our limits. I hear stories all the time, and maybe you hear some similar stories in your life. I hear people tell me, I used to go to church every Sunday, but life got really busy, and I've just not been in church for a while now. Or, hey, I really, there was a time in my life when every day I was practicing the spiritual disciplines, and I was having that quiet time with God. But, my responsibilities at work and at home and in the community just continued to increase. And I don't do that as regularly as I used to. I used to serve all the time, but there's just so much on my plate, and I don't have time to serve. Those are stories of people who have exceeded their limits. And when we exceed our limits, it seems though the first thing that gets pushed out of our life is God. And we don't experience Him as we can because we are exceeding our limits. I started this series a few weeks ago entitled Experiencing God on a Journey. We've been looking at the life of Moses from the book of Exodus. And I just want to give you a really quick review to bring you up to speed if you've not been with me every week. And we looked in Exodus chapter 1 and saw there that we experience God at work all the time. And there I reminded you that God is up to something even when we see nothing. Moses leaves Egypt and he's out in the wilderness and he's tending sheep, and there he comes across that burning bush and he experiences God for the very first time, and God asks Moses to go back to Egypt and to bring the people out of bondage, and Moses feels this is a job he is ill-equipped to handle. And there we saw in the life of Moses that our availability is more important than our ability. Moses eventually goes back to Egypt and he tells Pharaoh to let the people go, and Pharaoh refuses to do that and actually makes the work harder on the people, and the Egyptians turn on Moses, and his own people turn on him. And there we learn that you and I experience God when we persevere on, and I reminded you there that when life presses in, press on. Finally, after all of those plagues that come upon the Egyptians, Pharaoh tells Moses and the people to go. And we saw in the Passover and how we experience God's grace in that. And there I told you that when the blood is applied, sin and death are nullified. The people leave Egypt and they come and they're standing at the edge of the Red Sea, and behind them are the armies of Pharaoh, and there's no place for them to run, and they don't know what to do. And there we learned that God has a solution to your situation. If you watched last week, Pastor John talked about how they were in the wilderness and they were complaining over and over and over again to Moses, and there we learned that complaining is draining, that it will drain you and the people around you. And so we're going to pick up today in Exodus chapter 18 and see how you and I can experience God by not exceeding our limits. Now, in Exodus chapter 17, the people of Israel have their first battle with a nation of the Amalekites. And it's there, if you know the story, Moses is standing on the mountaintop, and as long as he held his hands up in the air, that the people of Israel started to be victorious. And if he let his hands drop, then the Amalekites started to get the upper hand. And there Moses stood with his hands up in the air, and he had to have people around him to help hold his hands up. And the Israelites were victorious. And I really love what it says there in Exodus 17. God tells Moses, hey, make sure you write this down so that Joshua never forgets what happened here on this day. And then in Exodus chapter 18, after that has happened, Moses has kind of a family reunion. His father-in-law comes to visit him. And what Moses is going to discover here from his father-in-law is the principle that I've given you today, that you need to unload before you overload. And so we're going to look at this in Exodus chapter 18, beginning in verse 13. We're going to look at some verses here through the end of the chapter. And the first thing that we see here is Moses' problem. I mean, just think about all that Moses had experienced to this point. There was the Passover, and then the Red Sea, and then they're in the wilderness, and people are complaining about not having water and not having anything to eat. And then they just to come off of a battle with the Amalekites, and all this weight that had to been on Moses' shoulders. I mean, any one of those things probably would have exceeded my limits. And here, Moses handled all of those things. And not just that, but as we read here in verse 13, I want you to feel the weight that Moses had to been feeling in his life. In verse 13, it says this: the next day, and this is after Jethro comes to visit him, the next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. I mean, here the text tells us that he came and he stood here to judge he was the judge for all the people. This may have been the first judicial backlog in the history of the world. There was one judge, and according to Exodus chapter 12, there were 600,000 men that came out of Egypt during the Exodus, and that did not include women and children. And so at this point, there's probably at least 1 million people. And Moses serves as a judge for all the people, and it tells us that they stood around him from morning till evening. He would listen to one dispute, and he would settle that, and then he would go to the next one, and he would go to the next one, and he'd go to the next one. From the moment the sun came up until the sun came down, all the people stood around him. Now Moses was doing what needed to be done. But what Moses was doing here was he was exceeding his limits. I can only imagine that Moses had to be exceeding his limits emotionally. He had to be exceeding his limits physically. I'm sure he had to be exceeding his limits even spiritually. And I wonder if you feel like Moses today. Where you just think, man, there are 1 million things that I got to get done today. Or hey, there's just 1 million things that I've got to handle at work. Or maybe you just feel, it just seems to you that there are 1 million people that are coming to you with their problems, and you just feel like Moses, and you just feel the weight of all that's going on in your life. And so I wonder, why is it that you and I oftentimes exceed our limits? And I think it comes down to one word, and it's fear. Some of you are like me, and we just have what our society today calls FOMO, the fear of missing out. And you know, when we're invited to the party, or when we're invited to go to this place, and when we're invited to do these things, that we want to go because we're afraid that if we don't go, we're going to miss out on the fun, we're going to miss out on what might happen there, we're going to miss out. And we just have that fear of missing out. And so we overextend ourselves, we exceed our limits because we're afraid of missing out on something. Some of you have a fear of what other people might think of you. You're afraid that if you don't work that overtime, you're afraid what your boss might think of you. You're afraid about what the other parents might think about you if your kids are not involved in every single youth sporting event that's taking place. Some of you are afraid of what people around you might think if you were unwilling to participate in something that's going on in your community or in your neighborhood. And some of you, I think, maybe even have a fear of just asking other people to help you. You know that the people around you are just as busy as you are, and you're afraid that you don't want to burden them by asking them to help you out. But whatever it is, it's fear. A fear of missing out, a fear of what other people might think, a fear of just simply asking someone else. I don't know if that's the fear, if Moses had any of those fears, but I do know that Moses was exceeding his limits. And the reason why I know that is because of Jethro's perception. And you and I need to unload before we overload. If you look here in verse number 14, it says, when his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, Jethro saw Moses meeting with person after person after person. Jethro saw Moses working through his lunch break. Jethro saw Moses at the end of the day wearied from everything that was going on, just slowly walking back to his tent. Jethro saw all that Moses was doing for the people, and he said, what is this you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? A very loose paraphrase of that is Jethro looked at Moses and said, Moses, what is this that you are doing? This is ludicrous. This is crazy. Why are you doing this yourself? And listen, the reason why Moses was doing this was it was sincere. It was out of his graciousness that he was doing this for the people. But Jethro was emphatic. If you look at verse 17, Moses' father-in-law replied, what you are doing is not good. Now, the way in which that Hebrew word is constructed, not good, at the end of verse 17, actually is written in a way to show strong disapproval. Jethro was saying to Moses, Moses, this is not good. This is not good for you. And I disapprove strongly of what I've just seen. And he said, and the reason why Jethro said this is because he knew that if Moses did not unload, that he was going to overload and he was going to burn out. If you look at verse 18, he says, you and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. He says, the work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Jethro is telling Moses, unload before you overload. And it's interesting to me in verse 18 when he says, you will only wear yourselves out. Again, when Jethro said that word to Moses, it's literally translated out of the Hebrew to sink or cause to fall down. And what he's saying to Moses, he said, Moses, if you don't unload, you're going to overload and you are going to sink. But don't miss what he says in verse 18. He says, you and these people who come to you will wear yourselves out. And that's true in my life. It's true in Moses' life. It's true in your life. That when you and I exceed our limits, it doesn't just affect us. It affects the people around us. Affects our spouse, our children, our families, our friends. And so here Jethro tells Moses, you need to unload before you overload. Neil Rudenstein was the 26th president of Harvard University. And when he was hired to be president of the university, he had an audacious goal to raise $2 billion in 5 years. And so he worked tirelessly for 3 years and averaged raising $1 million a day for 3 years. And on top of his fundraising initiative, Neil Rudenstein was also involved in, it seemed as though everything that was happening at the university. He fretted menus for the banquets that were held. He argued over the copay of the employees, and he would meet with the coaches of the sports teams, and he would write letters to the student publications, and had meeting after meeting after meeting with department chairs at the university, and he worked nonstop. And they say he averaged 12 to 15 hours a day. Those closest to Dr. Rudenstein said that he was only averaging about 3 hours of sleep a night. And then finally, after 3 years, it caught up to him. One morning, he just could not get out of bed. He couldn't force himself to go to work that day. And he went to the doctor, and he was diagnosed with severe fatigue and exhaustion. The board of trustees at Harvard University told Dr. Rudenstein that he had to take an indefinite leave of absence. And Dr. Rudenstein was not gone for just 7 days. He wasn't gone for just 7 weeks. Dr. Rudenstein was gone from the university for 7 months to recover from his exhaustion. He was wore out. He was exceeding his limits. In the Annals of Internal Medicine, it said that 24% of all Americans have complained of being fatigued for 2 weeks or longer. Fatigue is now considered one of the top 5 reasons people call their physician. And Leah Potts Fisher, who's the director for the Center for Work and Family in Berkeley, California, she said that everyone in America is being stretched emotionally, being stretched financially, being stretched in their time. And then she said this, and she said it's only a matter of time before they snap. You may need to hear the words of Jethro today in your life. You need to unload before you overload. You will wear yourself out. It is not good. Listen, overloading, exceeding your limits is not a strategy for success. It is a recipe for disaster. And so what happens next is Jethro gives Moses a plan. And this is Jethro's plan. It's actually kind of twofold. I'm going to read it and then we'll come back and look at it. In verse 19, he says, "Listen now to me." This is Jethro speaking to Moses. "Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice. And may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Jethro gives Moses a plan. It's really a twofold plan. Number one, he says to Moses, Moses, you've got to delegate. You've got to ask other people to help you because you cannot carry this load by yourself. And it has to be capable people. If you ask somebody that's incapable of doing this, it's just going to make your load even heavier. But Moses, you need to hand some stuff off. I heard a story about a sailor who was getting onto the boat and he was carrying an anchor. And when he got onto the boat, he slipped and he fell overboard and he went down under the water. He came up, he went down again, he came up, he went down a third time and finally came up again, and he shouted to all the people on board. He said, "If somebody doesn't come grab this anchor soon, I'm not going to be able to hold on to it much longer." And that's true for you maybe. Maybe you need to hand something off because it's just going to cause you to sink. You need somebody to help lighten your load. And the second part of this is he says to Moses, Moses, you just need to cut some stuff out of your life. He tells Moses at the beginning, he says, Moses, you are to be the representative to God on behalf of the people. You need to cut some of this other stuff out so that you can focus on what is most important. Because here's what I know about me, and probably is true about you as well, is that typically you and I don't have a scheduling problem. Typically we have a priority problem. Instead of when we're asked to do something, oftentimes we'll say, hey, let me look at my schedule and see if I can fit it in. And that's usually the wrong question to be asking. The question we should be asking is not, could I do this? And just because I could does not mean that I should. But the question we should be asking ourselves is does this activity have the potential to cause me to exceed my limits? Because you and I need to unload before we overload. Because the truth is this, is that if you and I continue to exceed our limits, the good things in our life are going to sink. We're going to sink relationally. We're going to sink spiritually. We're going to sink emotionally. Because when we exceed our limits, it's the most important things that seem to sink first. And you see, God has designed you and I with limits in mind. He's designed us in such a way so that we have limits, and He does not want us to exceed our limits. If you look at verse 24, it says this, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. Moses put this into practice, and Moses understood that he needed to unload before he overload. And maybe you need to do the same today. Maybe today you need to listen to the words of Jethro and understand that what you are doing is not good. It will only wear you out. And so how? How do we keep from exceeding our limits? A couple things. Number one is I think sometimes you and I need to reset. I think about the 5% most important things in your life. The 5% of things in your life that you cannot delegate to someone else. The 5% of things in your life that you cannot hire somebody else to do. The 5% of things in your life that you must be present for. The 5% that one day you're going to have to be accountable to God. Think about, what is that 5%? It has to be your spiritual life, your family, your children, your physical life. But what is that 5%? You and I sometimes need to reset. And what I'm saying is, these things should not just be a priority. The 5% should be the top priority. Like they should be far and away above everything else in our lives, so that when you and I are faced with a conflict about scheduling or what we should do, it should almost come as an easy decision to know that I'm not going to sacrifice any of these things. Because what happens when you and I start to exceed our limits is we sacrifice the important for the urgent. And there are so many people that just simply need to reset and understand what is the most important things in my life. And the other thing is just not to reset, but secondly is to recharge. You need to recharge daily, weekly, and seasonally in your life. You need to recharge daily. Some of you need to hear this. You need to be at home with your family. Some of you are so overloaded that you don't even have time for your own family. You need to be home with your family. You need to be practicing the spiritual disciplines in your life on a daily basis. You need to rest. Let me ask you, when does your day start? Most people say their day starts when they get out of bed. I would say to you, our day does not start when we get up. Our day starts when we go to sleep. If you look in Genesis chapter 1, when God is creating the entire world and the universe, it'll tell us that the evening and morning was day 1. Evening and morning was day 2. You see, in God's timetable, our day does not start in the morning, it starts the night before. And I love what Chuck Swindoll said one time. He said, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap. And so daily you need to recharge. And you also need to recharge weekly. You and I need to have a Sabbath day of rest. Now for some it may be Sunday, others it might need to be Wednesday or Monday, but you and I need a day in which we escape from the stress and the pressures and the duties and the things that need to be done on a day-to-day basis. And then you and I need to recharge seasonally. You need to take a vacation. You need to take time to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries and those special occasions in your life. But you and I need to recharge, and we need to schedule these things into our life. Listen, when you start to feel yourself being overloaded, it's kind of late to schedule that stuff. So you need to be intentional to schedule time for you to recharge. So I would encourage you this week, begin to look at your schedule, look at your day planner, look at what your week looks like, look at what your month looks like, and schedule in times for you to recharge. Moses did that, and what Moses experienced in his life was that he had time to experience God in a way he never did before. And when you unload before you overload, you will be glad that you did. After this happens, it was 1 month later when God asked Moses to go to the top of Mount Sinai. And there God gives Moses, the 10 Commandments. And in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 through 11, God talks about not exceeding their limits. He says this, he says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. When you fast forward to Exodus chapter 31, after God gets done talking to Moses on top of the mountain, the last thing God tells Moses before he goes down the mountain is, Moses, make sure you tell the people not to forget the Sabbath. And what God is telling Moses, he's saying, Moses, I have made limits. And you need to unload before you overload. It happened a couple centuries ago. There were merchant ships that were being overloaded, and they were sinking all the time. And then a maritime man by the name of Plimsoll designed what is now known as the Plimsoll line. Maybe you've seen them on boats. And what it is it's markings on the side of the boat that lets them know that when the boat is being loaded, that how much it can be loaded and what its limits actually are. And that line is there to inform them that the ship is getting close to being overloaded. You and I have signs in our life. Some of you start to get irritable. Some of you start to get angry. And some of you start to get fatigued and frustrated. But you've got to identify these signs so that you can unload before you overload. Just as I close here, another side effect of the COVID-19 pandemic was discovered by the Michigan Fire Inspector Association. They said in 2020 there was a 78% increase in fatal fires in Michigan. And what they discovered was the reason why for all these fires was that everybody was at home and everybody was doing work virtually and going to school virtually and shopping virtually. And they said that everybody was plugging their devices into the outlets, and what was happening was that people were overloading the outlets, which became a fire hazard, caught the house on fire, and people died as a result. Some of you need to know that you are overloading your life, and you need to unload before you overload. Because when you overload, when you exceed your limits, you are in danger. Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you for the ways in which it speaks to us. God, I pray that you would allow us to be able to see when we are exceeding our limits. May we heed those signs. May we listen to the words of Jethro and understand that what we are doing is not good, and we will only wear ourselves out. And so, God, I pray for the people today who need to unload before they overload. And pray, God, that they would lighten the load that they are carrying so that they can experience you in a way in which they've never experienced you before. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to see you soon.